All right, guys. Hey, I know it's been a couple weeks since we've done one of these, so a lot of really intense and great questions again this week. In what has ended up being an incredibly um, historical week with the first ever indictment of a former president on criminal charges, and it very likely will not be the last time. I will comment in another video about the indictment in New York and what that does or does not mean, but I want to get to a lot of these questions. So we had multiple questions this week about voting online. That would, if there was ever a way of doing it online that was going to be considered secure and accepted by everybody, then obviously that is the best way to go. Problem with that is I really cannot foresee at this point any method of online voting that would be completely accepted by both the right and the left. And considering that there is one party in this, there is one side of the aisle that seems to prefer restricting voting, um, opening it up to as many people as possible and making it as convenient as possible. It doesn't really seem like that's politically going to actually happen anytime soon. Um, okay, another question that we had was about whether or not the Electoral College actually reflects the majority. The Electoral College, with its original intent, was to kind of let the people have a voice and reflect population, but then let the electors make the final decision. I think you can make a pretty strong argument that the Electoral College is moving away from majority opinion because of, when if you're talking about the majority, you're talking about the most people, then you're talking about, very large population centers. I always like to use California as an example because they have 55 electoral college votes, but they also have a huge amount of population. But no matter how much you win California by, um, let's say that Hillary Clinton or let's say Joe Biden won California by 20 million votes, let's just say, okay, won it by 20 million votes. It doesn't matter. He still is only getting those 55 electoral college votes. So it was partially designed to offset huge population centers from overriding your Nebraskas and your Idahos and places like that more than was necessary. So you can also see this in Senate representation because every state has two senators, and therefore, for example, like the politics of the Senate has gotten kind of out of whack with what we seem to see reflected in polls that reflect that are taking over the whole country, things like abortion, stuff like that. The politics of the Senate, is becoming more skewed, a little bit more conservative because there's more red states than there are blue states, and every state gets two senators. So this has a tendency. This is definitely growing towards skewing that. Um, let's see. Um, we had a really good question about compulsory voting, and kind of was asking like what I think about how Australia, you get a tax fine. I've been to other countries like Peru, for example, where if you are a citizen of Peru and you did not vote in the last election, if you want to come back into the country, you have to pay a fine. Compulsory voting sounds great. The only thing you need to think about with compulsory voting is yes, you have higher turnouts, but are those educated, informed voters who actually want to vote? Um, People who aren't following elections voting isn't always the greatest thing because they're not up to date on where candidates stand in policy and they can be easily manipulated. And when you're being forced to vote, sometimes that results in people who aren't paying attention as much as you would like. I personally, if you're on the right side of the aisle, left side of the aisle, independent, whatever, that is not my concern. But I do want whoever's voting for whichever side, I always really just want them to understand what they're voting for, what their candidates stand for, and what those policies will mean to them in everyday life. Compulsory voting doesn't really, it gets a higher turnout for sure, but it does not necessarily result in the best results for the people. Um, One thing somebody asked about, kind of like whether or not it was representing the people, the votes, our system with the electoral college and everything really represents the people. There were about 6 months ago, there were 200 political scientists that wrote a letter to, I believe it was the Federal Elections Commission or Congress, and they were talking about how we need to introduce proportional representation to help sort of take the temperature down in this country from all the polarization. And what proportional representation does is it gives, instead of the winner take all scenario. So you need to understand, in basically every election in America, it's a winner take all, meaning that at a minimum, 49% of the population, roughly, of that district or that constituency did not get the person they chose because it's winner take all. But if you introduce something like proportional representation, it takes the temperature down, because if, let's say, the 20% of the people in the country who consider themselves to be libertarians, that's not a real statistic, I'm just using that as an example. Let's say there's 20%, right now they feel they have no voice because libertarians don't hold any real significant office. But what if they were able to get 20% of the legislature and have their views reflected in Congress and feel like they had a voice? I do think that that would help take the temperature down, because the Electoral College, with the winner take all, Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, it's not allowing for a lot of compromise, and it's creating a lot of polarization. So I'm actually personally a fan of proportional representation. I think when people have a voice, it can help reduce polarization and anger that we have a really upsetting amount of in this country right now. So somebody was asking about Citizens United and super PACs. Citizens United, if anybody's interested, just request it. There's a great podcast on Citizens United that I use in class that I don't think was actually in the textbook notes, but super PACs, the way that case was decided was essentially it ended up being a free speech question, and whether or not allowing corporations to be able to participate in the political process was curbing their free speech. And this is where we get corporations are people, and everybody went nuts about it. But since that case was decided in 2010, we have seen an explosion in outside money in politics. Somebody had asked about campaign donations. In general, when you look at the chart of like what you can give to one party or one candidate, usually the general election and the primary is considered two different elections. So you can give the allotted amount for the primary election, and then the same allotted amount for the general election for that candidate without problems. Super PACs cannot give money directly to candidates or campaigns, but they can advocate 100% on behalf of the candidate. You can be business partners, like the person running the super PAC and the candidate that they are supporting. They can be business partners. They can own islands together. There's all kinds of ridiculous aspects about super PACs. Corporations, which cannot directly give money to campaigns from their own coffers, well, they can also form a PAC and then run the money from the corporation to the PAC to the candidate. There's just a lot of problems with the introduction of that much money. I invite you to go study other like electoral systems where, in Europe, a lot of elections are like you have multiple candidates. You have multiple candidates. It lasts for a few months. Outside money is seldom used, and you have an election. It goes away. Right now, the president running for president in the United States is really a 4-year process. Technically speaking, it should only be about 14 to 16 months when the debates start in September the year before. But it is at this point, it is legitimately a 2 to 3 year process. I mean, Ron DeSantis is running for president. He hasn't announced yet, but he's running for president. That's why he's giving speeches in Iowa and New Hampshire. Nikki Haley has declared she's running for president. Okay, she declared several months ago. Donald Trump declared 6 months ago, I think, at this point officially. There's various reasons why people think he did that, but still, and we're looking at a 2-year process of how long it takes to run for president. And so, yeah, whether or not that's a good thing is a totally debatable situation. Different types of primaries. Had a good question about this. When it talks about different types of primaries, you have open and closed primaries. That's all you really need to focus on is open and closed primaries. Essentially what that means is if it's an open primary, anybody who's registered to vote in the state can vote for either party. And if it's a closed primary, you have to be a registered member of that party. Okay, so Democrat or Republican. So, and this can sort of play a role in politics. It's not dirty politics, it's just politics. But let's say, for example, we'll use Georgia, for example, during the Republican primary for governor or the Democratic primary for governor. Let's say that you were a registered Democrat and you thought that maybe Brian Kemp would be easier to beat than, Perdue. Okay. No problem. So you just and you know that Stacey Abrams is going to win the Democratic nomination. So you decide it's an open primary, right? So you decide that instead of going and spending your vote for Stacey Abrams, you're going to go over to the Republican side and try to vote for Brian Kemp because you think he'll be easier to beat. That's an example of how an open primary can be used. Back in 2008, there was an effort to get people to vote for Obama because they thought Obama would be easier to beat than Hillary Clinton. They actually turned out to be very wrong about that. So that's not dirty politics. That's just kind of politics. But that's the difference between an open and closed primary. And independents kind of just don't have a lot of options sometimes. Let's see here. Okay, one thing that I absolutely wanted to talk about was broken promises about candidates. Like, do candidates keep the promises that they make? Give you two examples about this. Donald Trump promised that we were going to build a wall and that Mexico was going to pay for it. He tried to build some of the wall. Mexico didn't pay for it. Joe Biden promised to forgive student loans when he was running for office. He tried, but I would imagine that they knew that that actually wasn't going to hold up to, the courts, and it's probably going to get thrown out because in reality, he doesn't really have the authority to do what he's doing. Because all money that gets spent in the federal government has to be allocated by Congress, and Congress did not approve this move. So, in that money, they're trying to kind of pull a trick with forgiving $500 billion worth of student loan debt, and the courts aren't really going to stand for it. So, one thing that I hope that students get out of taking American government is that when you leave, and many of you aren't going to pursue politics beyond this, or you're not going to go to law school or anything, but some of you will. But for the broader majority of you, what I hope is that you kind of at least learn enough that when 5 years down the road, when you hear a president say they can do this, that you understand that, well, what does Congress look like? Does this actually fall within the executive authority, or are they just saying they're going to do something that they really don't have the authority to do? And that's where an educated population is really important. You don't if you know that somebody's lying, that's very helpful. And unfortunately, a lot of the population just wants to hear certain things. But Nancy Pelosi had said before the election that the president doesn't have the power to just write off hundreds of billions of dollars in student loans. She even had said it. So I really honestly think the Biden administration just sort of tried to do it and kind of knew deep down inside that it wasn't going to hold up to constitutional muster, which it hasn't. Somebody asked about independents and primaries. You don't have to go through a primary process if you don't have any competition. So if you are a member of a political party that doesn't have anybody running against you, you really don't have to go through the primary process. Donald Trump in 2020 didn't go through a primary process because there were no other Republicans running against him in 2020. If he does actually end up running in 2024, he's going to have a few people that challenge him. Joe Biden has already, it looks like Robert F. Kennedy, or a member of the Kennedy family, he has officially filed the paperwork to run for president. So it looks like in 2024, Joe Biden may have a challenger if he does, in fact, run. Still have reservations about whether or not an 82-year-old president or presidential candidate is actually going to try to run in 2024. So we'll have to see what happens. Gerrymandering. Had another question about gerrymandering. Hopefully, from the congressional chapter when it was talked about originally. Gerrymandering is when House districts are redrawn for political or racial reasons. Okay, so it's manipulated. It's not the process of redistricting. It's a corrupt process of redistricting. Partisan gerrymandering has been upheld by the Supreme Court as just politics, and it is constitutional. And it does skew our electorate. It happens every 10 years because you have a census every 10 years. The reason why we have a census is to know how many people are living in the country and where they are living, and we use that information to hand out House districts, which there are 435 of those now. So that's what gerrymandering is, when redistricting is done for political or racial reasons, and it is usually in the states where gerrymandering is a problem. It is in states where it is controlled by the state legislature or the governor's office. and they will, Republican or Democrat, they use it to their advantage to try to shape districts that will be favorable to their interest or guarantee a certain number of Democratic representatives or a certain number of Republican representatives. And it is constitutional. It's not, I want to say it's constitutional. It has not been found to be unconstitutional. Now, racial gerrymandering, when you draw districts for racial reasons, that has been struck down by the courts. Okay. And one last question. If I somehow missed your question or whatever, please, by all means, shoot me a line on Discord or whatever. AI and voting manipulation. I strongly encourage you to look into Cambridge Analytica and things like that, and how that was used in the 2016 election in the United States and in Brexit in England before that. Cambridge Analytica is a great example of that. The algorithm, in my opinion, the algorithms on social media, especially with our older generations who are starting to more and more get their information from either cable news or from Facebook. You got to understand that from a political standpoint, the algorithm hunts you. So in the past, for you to fall victim of propaganda, you either had to hear it, like be around it, or you would see a poster or something like that. We're in a very different world now where the propaganda has access to what you think because of what you like on social media. It understands how to manipulate you and how to send things towards you, what videos you are going to respond on, because they know, because they've tracked and analyzed what you interact with voluntarily, and then they use that to send you information. Nefarious forces use that to kind of channel you into an echo chamber. And guys, I'll just simply tell you, the echo chambers going on politically right now are the biggest threat to democracy that we have, because I've been talking politics my entire life. The last 6 years, things have been very different, because it has gone from just being able to talk politics with people to, facts are somehow now negotiable. This whole notion of fake news, to where it's like you can't even really have, if two people disagree on politics, it has become very hard for them to have a logical, relaxed conversation, because they're debating on whether or not the basic established facts are even true. And it's really hard to get anywhere politically, or just to have a civil conversation with somebody, when you can't even agree that the sky is blue, and that's kind of where we're at. So that is the video for this week. If I missed your question, you want it answered, by all means, just shoot me a message on Discord, and I'll either respond directly to you or make another video covering it. Hope everybody's doing well, and talk to you soon.